Hey there, this is Dr. Von Duke, and this is my quick and dirty guide to can't say that word, pre-rubric course tasks. So in this video, I want to quickly cover the notion of student interviews, video permissions, context for learning, baseline assessments, lesson plans, and final assessments. So more detailed information is available in my course under the same name. But these will cover some of the high points of things that you need to consider when you're doing this. I am Dr. Von Duke. I'm a professor of education, a certified Pearson reviewer, and an EdTPA consultant with 100% pass rate in the past 6 years of my working teacher candidates. This channel is a result of my desire to lessen the stress experienced while candidates are endeavoring to pass the EdTPA. One stress having to be figuring out what is meant by the portfolio questions. And even though there's lots of helpful material, it's not organized in a way that's systematic and strategic. Second is, while you are a good teacher and you can probably figure out how to do this thing, the mental burden of this work is quite high. And you might ask yourself, is this a good time for you to take on that much added mental challenge? Well, you know the answer to that. While it is true that you could simply throw your work out there and see how it scores, failure to pass a task or two can cost you anywhere from $100 to $300. So I share EdTPA strategies freely and publicly on this channel, along with offering fee-based products, including more systematic and detailed courses and consulting should you feel you need it. Okay, that all said, what pre-rubric tasks do you need to do? So I suggest that you interview students, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Create or copy a baseline assessment that must include prerequisite skills that are needed by your student, and you'll see why later. Create lesson plans for 3 objectives underneath your overall lesson goal and not more. Prepare your classwork, exit tickets, or observation data sheets, and then prepare your summative or daily assessment. So this is your final assessment, summative being at the end of your entire unit, or a daily assessment for each lesson objective. Now, I have a viewable interview document linked below, so you can see what it is. The editable version that's downloadable is included in the course by the same name, and links to that are below. But when you interview a student, you're going to want to find out what kind of home experiences have helped them to understand the lesson objectives. Now, understand that the EdTPA is primarily academic in nature. So although their student might have an IEP that's based on behavioral considerations, the EdTPA might be based on a standard requirement and not on any of those behavioral objectives at all, although you'll put that in there. So you'll look at the students' home experiences, their culture, their home assets, their personal interests as they relate to this academic goal. Secondly, this paranoia that I'm not being, yes, I am recording, sorry. Okay, what prior learning or learning experiences has your student had that will help them understand the lesson? So one way to find that out, by the way, is as you're laying out your lesson material, you can ask your student, where have you seen this before? Where have you had an experience that relates to this? So that's one way to incorporate some academic questions into your student interview. And then what experiences both at home or at school give students an embodied contextual cultural understanding of the lesson material that you're presenting. And then here's the strategic part, which feels sort of wrong to me as a teacher. Nevertheless, I think it's important for you to consider that you might choose 3 or 4 students to interview and then pick the student who you have the most relatable interaction with. Is that student expressive enough? Do they get along well with you? Do you guys have a comfort with each other? That's going to show up on the video, which is task 2, and you're going to be asked if there's respect and rapport between you and your students, for instance. And then also I would say choose the student who has the most assets that are relatable to your academic goals, since those are an important part of the EdTPA scoring. So if you're looking at 2 students who are equally relatable, but which one has some interests, home culture that relates to your academic interest, that would be the student I would pick. And then on the lesson plan template, which you can view below, and again, only the course has the downloadable version, but just summarize what you learned in these different areas that connect to the academics that you're interested, and then brainstorm. So in red, sort of my brainstorming place, think about how you can more specifically connect that area to your measurable outcomes in your lesson, your learning objectives. Another thing to consider is you have to have, well, do you need video permission to, for task 2, you video you and your student. So, and perhaps other students in the room. So anybody in the room with you, any students, depending on your working context, most work contexts would want you to get video permission slips from parents with a guarantee that nothing of their children's name, information, anonymity will be kept. Nothing is put out there on the public space. You can know that your student's anonymity will be protected by Pearson because their information is under password on private servers, and at most, maybe 4 scores at most would be have access to it. Usually it's 2. If there was a problem with the scoring or a great discrepancies between scores, then you might have a supervisor who would also have access to it. So at most 5 people might be looking at those videos. But again, your students, it's assumed that your student's name is redacted or blocked out, but even if it's not, you're not going to get in trouble for that. None of this is going to go to a public space. However, you don't really have to upload a video permission form to the TPA. You don't have to prove that you got this. So just do it where it's important because it impacts your job. But say you're working with a student who's a cousin and is special needs, and you're going to do the lessons with that student. That's fine. You don't have to get video permission maybe from your relative, and nothing is required of you. Should you want to see a video permission form, something that would be printable on your school letterhead, for instance, there's links there. They'll be linked below. They'll be linked below. This PowerPoint will be linked below so that you can access all these links on the PowerPoint. Okay, the context for learning document is not scored. So keep it simple, don't overthink it. The way the context for learning document is used is the reviewer is going to look at it quickly to assess the age, the gender, maybe the special needs accommodations that your student has. Perhaps they'll look at if you have constraints on your curriculum, like you're supposed to use a certain one required in your district, and anything about your school's information is supposed to go there. The demographics, the success rate on standardized tasks. Is your school a failing school overall? Is it doing well or above board? Just very briefly, and you can usually find that information if you put your state between DOE and .gov. You have 4 pages submitted as one file, whether it's a PDF or a Word document. Be careful to use the original form that EdTPA gives you, and don't extract from that onto a Word document, but use their form. Okay, you're going to need to create a baseline. And again, I have a baseline template link here where you can see the different sections that I'm talking about. And in that baseline, I'm going to ask you to write down your overall lesson goal, and then, do each of your lesson objectives add up to it. So again, looking at the baseline, there's a standard academic goal that you would have. Too many of these open. Or an IEP goal, or but only if it's academic. So you might have an IEP goal that is behavioral in nature, right? You can state that there, but your measurable objectives are not on behavior, but only on academics. So if you have a behavioral goal, then stick to your academic alternative or early childhood standard. The lesson unit goal is the overarching subspecies of this goal. So maybe your student is supposed to learn about equivalent fractions. You might talk about equivalent fractions, halves, quarters, thirds, and fifths, for instance, would be your lesson goal. So not all equivalent fractions, but some subset of that. And then your lessons, your 3 lessons will have an objective, and that objective will be measurable. Now, what I ask you to do for each of those measurable objectives is to consider, and this is really a key point here, what prerequisite skills does the student need to have or already has that helps them obtain the skills that you'll be teaching, assuming that they don't already have all or most of these skills. So for instance, perhaps your student really knows how to identify fractional pieces. So you have a material that has halves and quarters and thirds and so forth, and your student is very good at recognizing what those are. And so that would be, it can be a question, so you can have pictures that they identify. It can be a task. So your baseline, in fact, your whole assessment can just be you observing the student completing certain tasks, and you have a list of observations where you're looking for certain things, and you have notes on that. And where you have a student that's not yet a reader or very disabled, that might be the most appropriate way. So do each of the lesson objectives lead to your overall goal? Do the prerequisite skills and knowledge lead to your lesson objective? Do your questions reflect what each student will need to be able to answer to prove that they can do the objective? So whatever this objective is here, let's say it's knowing the equivalent fractions between 1/2 and 1/4. Let's just say it was that simple, right? So we have our prerequisite skills. Well, what kind of mathematical questions can you ask here that would show the skills? Can make equivalents, can recognize numerator versus denominator, can add fractions together until they get to an equivalent amount. And so each of those would go there. And that, you have to be solid in your mind that what you're assessing meets that objective. So if the students can do those things, they have met that objective. And then you need to decide how many of those questions will they need to answer correctly to move to the next lesson objective. So supposing under this lesson objective, there was 3 skills to master: adding fractions to get to a larger equivalent, dividing a larger equivalent to get to portions, describing and naming numerators, describing and naming denominators, right? How many of the questions for each of these skills will you have, and how many of these overall should the student get for you to feel like, well, we know enough, we can move on to lesson 2. Okay. On the lesson template, I then ask you to summarize what you learn about your student. So say, for instance, on the baseline is a prerequisite skill that my student needs to recognize the addition symbol. Question 1 asks, maybe it's an observational task. You just ask your student, what should you do when you see a plus sign? And the student can answer, correctly. So that would be a strength. That's a prerequisite strength that you can later build on. And that is evidence of that student strength. Totally important for the EdTPA. And then let's say that you have 3 or 4 questions for the skills your student needs to master for objective 1, and they can only answer 1 out of 4 of those questions. So this becomes a need. And let's say in this case, the need was to name these 4 consonant sounds when they begin a word. So you would name that skill. And then you would give a little detail there that he could only successfully identify F when it was shown as a beginning sound. Very, 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 very important when you summarize this here. It doesn't ask you to do this anywhere on the EdTPA, but it asks you to draw on this kind of information repeatedly. And then you go on to objective 2 and do the same thing. All right, so let me tell you how these lesson plans then factor as evidence. The reviewer will look at your planning commentary for task 1 and make sure that what you say that is on your lesson is in fact in your lesson plan. So they'll look for a match between those 2 things. They'll also use it to clarify things you wrote about in your commentary. Maybe you didn't have a lot of information about what you did in a lesson sequence, and so they'll go back to see more about what happened. Now, while reviewers are told to do this, I wouldn't bank on it. You always want to be specific in your commentary, but your lesson plans can be a backup if you fail to do so in some way, or especially if the reviewer just felt like, I'm unfamiliar with what the student is talking about here. Let me see if I can get more information. And then in task 3, the reviewer will look back at your lesson plans to make sure that the assessments that you also upload as artifacts are tied to your lesson plans. So they factor as evidence in multiple places. Now, once you've analyze your student's baseline and you've interviewed your student, then you can start adjusting your lesson plan. So you want to tighter your lesson plans. Your lesson plans should show both challenge and support. On the video in task 2, you don't want your student to easily answer every single question, everything that you do, because that shows no challenge. So what prerequisite skills does the student already understand? What is missing for the student? What lesson objectives does the student do well on? What lesson objectives does the student seem to struggle with? And then here's a key idea. How can you make the easier concepts more challenging? How can you tighter your lesson plans up? And how can you make harder concepts more accessible? Do you need to tighter it down, or do you need to make sure that you provide adequate support? How can you provide that adequate support? So on the lesson plans, of course, I've already gone over this section. That your lesson objectives should be measurable, not can you run, but how far can you run or how fast can you run? So a non-example of a lesson objective would be, that's not measurable, would be the student will define plot, character, and sequence. So that's fine for an objective, but to make it a measurable objective, you would say that the student can answer correctly 8 out of 10 on the lesson 2 objective questions about plot, character, and sequence. So, and then you also, as you're writing your lesson objectives and task supports and the sequence of activities in them, 2 things you need to think of: the logic of your lesson objectives themselves. So why does lesson 2 come after lesson 1? And why does lesson 3 come after lesson 2? What is the object there? Are you building challenge? Are you building on prior concepts? Are you diminishing supports? And then the same can be said of the tasks within a lesson objective. Why are they sequenced in the way they are? In the same way, like, what is the reason for that? Very often when we provide students with a lot of support, we're lessening the cognitive burden on the student. They don't have to keep so many pieces in their head. And we ask them to produce 1 piece. And then maybe the next time we ask them to produce 2 pieces and so forth. Or we give them a graphic organizer so they can learn to put those cognitive pieces on a piece of paper to refer to, rather than trying to keep all those ideas in their head. So the logic of our activities might be to lessen the mental burden on the student as they're acquiring this new skill and so many pieces. Lesson times are assumed to be, for older students, about an hour. So middle, especially high school students, you would expect it to be about an hour. But of course, for younger students, it's not going to be expected to be that long. 15, 20 minutes would be about right for an elementary student. But if your lesson time, don't put that your lesson time was 10 minutes or your lesson time was 15 minutes if it's an older student, or 20 minutes even. It's best if you just leave times off. And note that if you have 3 lessons, but you're only allowed to put in 20 minutes worth of video time, and you're only allowed to upload 2 files, you're going to not get all 3 of your lessons on video that you then use. So be aware of that when you're creating your lessons, that each of your lessons have the kind of content that you want to see on the videos, and that's on the lesson plan template as well. So planning engagement and support would be pretty easy at this point, because you've already done the prior learning experience and interest of the student. You've already been brainstorming, so you can write in a little bit more detail about how you looked at how it connected academically to your student. Now, how can you use that connection in a way that's engaging your student into the lesson? So maybe reminding the student of a prior, you might begin a lesson reminding a student of a prior experience they have, asking them to describe it, and then pointing out the salient features that relate to your lesson and moving forward like that. A communication skill will be asked for in the special education lesson planning. And the thing that they're really looking for is whether or not you supported the use of the student's communication skill. So let me say two things about this. One is that if your lesson itself was a communication skill, say learning vocabulary words, then your communication skill in your lesson has to be something else, something beyond that. So putting it together in a paragraph orally, asking appropriate questions, just a communication skill that allows the student to demonstrate or participate in the lesson. But again, very often it will just be using the proper vocabulary. You know how students will say this one and that one, and you would say, well, what is that one called? And what is this one called? You want me to get this? What is this? Oh, it's the quarter size fraction piece. Okay, let's use that name. So, so the skill would be perhaps using correct vocabulary when identifying the parts of the lesson or participating in it. And then how will you support the student to use this communication skill? Be very specific here. Will you remind them to use the correct name? Will you have a word wall where you have a sheet of vocabulary? Will you have some sort of graphic organizer? Will they be able to flip materials over and see the word? Will you model it? Will you echo it? In what ways will you support the student to use this communication skill? Will you pause and ask them to re-express? Those are all supports for the communication skill. And it's a pretty easy one to obtain, but you must plan for it. And then again, not only are you going to put the sequence of activities here, but you're going to explain the logic of the order of objectives and the order of the activities within the objective. Here's an important part to really consider. What effect does the change in the sequence of your, what does each change, so each new task or activity, how does it change your students' learning? What effect does it have on the learning to go to that next task? Is it adding a little bit harder concept, more challenge, reducing supports? So are you putting more cognitive load off the student initially, but then you start to build on it or get them to use some sort of a support material to organize that cognitive load and then be able to extract what they need at the last moment? So exactly what is it that you're doing there? And then as you're looking at your list of activities, where do you let the student initiate actions or responses? Where have you let him initiate or her? Where do you add pauses in order for the student to be able to initiate? Where do you ask them questions like, what do you see here? What does this remind you of? So you need to make sure that you remind yourself in your lesson writing to have places for the student to initiate. And then how will you differentiate up? So if you can see that your student needs greater challenge. So supposing you're in the middle of your task 2 video, you already thought your lesson was a good balance of support and challenge. And now you realize that all of this is very easy for the student and you're not going to get anything on that video that convinces the reviewer that it's challenging. Well, you need to have a couple of activities in your back pocket that you quickly pull out and give to the student to up the challenge. I recommend that this, if you go to this link here called Goal Book, you can have 2 weeks of free use of it, and it provides lesson plans with differentiation, plus it provides evidence-based practices. So the theory and research that you want to use to support your use of that method, which is also part of the lesson plans. It's really great. And it also has ways to differentiate down. So supposing you're in the middle of a lesson and you realize, oh, this is really too hard. It's really over that student's head. And I need to find a way to support them or to restate this question in a way that brings the challenge down. Again, Goal Book is a great friend in providing some tools for doing that. But regardless, please write those out ahead of time so that you're ready with that to go. Another thing is you're going to be asked to provide feedback. So where did I put that here? I don't know if I have that one here, but it's on the lesson 10 template. And it also, I go through all of these issues much more slowly in the course connected below. But in rubric 8, it asks you to provide your student with feedback that is specific and tied to their strengths and needs. So, you know, your student, you would say to them, you did that very well. You chose to get the right fractional parts and you put them together and you made sure carefully that you matched that and then you got to the right answer. Or their needs, you didn't go back and check and make sure you had the right fractional part. So when you got to the end, you didn't have the correct answer. And then do you provide a strategy for them to be able to make that correction on their own? So can they flip the assignment over and check if they got the correct answer or not? And if they didn't, is there a list which takes them through the steps? So maybe they could get the fractional pieces they need, check that they have the right sizes, then add them, for instance, right? Then here's a tricky one that you might not have thought of, but you also need to plan for going over the feedback with them. By the way, when you give them the feedback, you have to plan that they can try again. And ideally, if they can initiate responding to your feedback with trying again, so providing for a little pause in there, and then evaluate how they did. But then you also would need to plan to go over the feedback with them to ensure that they understood it. So a perfect way is to conference with them, go over the feedback with them, give them a chance to try again, ask them to read the feedback to you and express to you what they think it means and what they would do differently next time, and then make sure that's in coordination with what you're actually telling them. And then finally, you have to have a daily lesson assessment. Now, these can be just the questions off of your baseline that relate to the lesson 1. That's all it needs to be. What makes this assessment academically challenging for your students? So drawing on the evidence of your baseline, you can say this assessment will be challenging for the student because on the baseline, they scored 1 out of 4 on these particular questions. Say that was it. And then what supports will you provide while the student is taking this assessment? Will you have cards for them to organize, or a graphic organizer, or something hands-on, or will you model or mouth or point? And then what will you do to reteach skills not met? So that will be asked in task 3 when it says, you know, what would you do differently? So in this case, if they don't get, say, one of the skills that you wanted to teach as part of your lesson 1, how would you reteach that in a new or different way? So not just doing it again, but how would you do it differently, hoping that maybe a different approach would be more meaningful for the student? Okay, when you write your assessments, whether it's a summative, that is a final assessment, or a daily assessment, it can come from observational checklists, exit tickets, in-class assignments, or daily quizzes or tests. And then you want to make sure that you're not asking multiple choice questions so that you can see the steps of action that the student took and follow their thinking, say through solving a math problem or writing evidence on a graphic organizer and then drawing it into a paragraph. If you just ask multiple choice questions, it's hard to know if they just guessed or not, or what their thinking process was. And then if you have older students, especially a summative assessment, instead of giving a daily lesson objective, you might do one at the end of the whole unit, just to see that the student has met that overall learning goal and requirement. It's not a requirement to do a summative. It's really whatever's grade level appropriate for your student. Okay, so then at the top now of the lesson plan graphic that I gave you, it really mimics task 1, question 1, where they ask you to summarize your lesson objectives and your plan supports. I add measurable outcomes here because they want to see that, but they don't ask for it here in this table. So they ask for it later, but so if you have your objective to be able to name 4 out of 5 4 beginning consonants, FS, BD, the measurable outcome is that they can correctly pick out the correct consonant when given words to read. And then the requirement for the student to move to the next objective, let's say that they get 3 out of 4 consonants correct consistently. And then what are your planned supports? So looking at the activities and looking at your baseline evaluation, how will you support them in areas that they're weak, and how will you scaffold to areas where they are strong? What's the evidence that they have that need taken from the baseline? What's the specific detail of the support you'll provide? So you'll, and then what strategies you might or might not have to help them do this work on their own or do it more successfully. And then if their IEP has a section related to academics and recommends a support or a strategy, you can put that there. All right, as always, the EdTPA information can be found on their website. You can get EdTPA documents either by signing up. You have 18 months to complete the document or get your refund. If you're concerned that you might not get it done in that period, you can go to your educator's preparation program, maybe your master's program or your undergraduate program. They often have EdTPA resources there. And sometimes you can just put EdTPA commentaries PDF in Google, and some folks will have posted it somewhere that you can obtain something so that you can look at it. The current versions are still, they're listed as version 8, 2021. They're the same thing that was in 2018. They really haven't changed. If you would like to take the course that goes with this quick and dirty pre-rubrics course, it's here, and then the subsequent courses on task 1, additional courses are at this link. And as always, you can inbox me for individual consulting if you're feeling overwhelmed. Here's where I feel that the overwhelm might be important for you to consider. It's quite a significant mental burden to work your way through this. And I can give you feedback and mock scores that can let you know you're on track. Or you can simply take these courses and that I offer below, and they will stepwise in detail walk you through. So, you know, if you are in a position where you have the space and time to tackle this on your own, then you don't need me. Awesome. I hope these short, quick and dirty videos give you enough support. But if you've got a lot on your plate, I really recommend that you consider at least getting some of the courses below, especially the first ones in each task, as they're foundational. When I consult, I work with elementary, secondary, and special education portfolios. And again, the details are there. So I look forward to seeing you around at the next video, and good luck, and keep teaching.